Hi, I'm Tori, and today I'm going to be discussing the book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. This is the novel that the Blade Runner movies are based on, and I have not seen any of those, so I wanted to read the book before I saw the movies. So this book came out in 1968, and it is very much a traditional science fiction book. It takes place on an Earth that has been almost destroyed by a nuclear war, and all the people left on Earth are barely surviving. Most people have migrated to Mars, I believe it is, and the ones left have to deal with the fallout of this nuclear war. And the Earth is just covered in this horrible radioactive dust that corrupts people's minds, and so people are always having to take these IQ tests to prove that they are still at a normal level of intelligence, and if they're not, then they get downgraded. They're not allowed to reproduce anymore. It's implied that they might be sterilized in some way, and they're not allowed to migrate off-world anymore, and they are barely treated as human beings. And so to convince people to migrate to Mars, in addition to, just escaping all this horrible dust, the government has also said that if they migrate, they'll get their own android servant to help them out. So an android is like a robot, but it's made of organic material, so it looks just like a human, and it's very hard to tell them apart. And as the technology's gotten better and better, it's harder and harder to test to see if someone you encounter is a human or an android. And that would be fine, but when the androids live on Mars, they are slaves and don't like that. So some of them will attack their owners, often killing them, and escape back to Earth. And there on Earth, they'll try to blend in with the normal human population. So the protagonist of the novel, Rick Deckard, is a bounty hunter, and it is his job to try to track down androids that are living on Earth masquerading as normal human beings. So we follow Rick Deckard over just a couple days as he tries to capture a specific group of androids who have been located on Earth. And so basically throughout this time, he's trying to figure out what makes a human, and how androids and humans are different, and what really defines a person as being alive and being their own entity, or just being a machine. And if there is any point in time where a robot can become human enough that it has rights too. And so I like this book a lot. It was very dark, very gritty. The world was incredibly gloomy, like just the atmosphere. There was very little light, I think because of the fallout from the nuclear war, and every single character was just like barely scraping by, barely functioning. And it was just a really fun, gritty science fiction novel. So I would highly recommend it. If you want to read it, go do that, and then come back to hear my opinions. So throughout this book, I always felt a little off balance and didn't quite know what to believe. You have that whole scene where Deckard goes to give the Voight-Kampff test to Miss Luft, and she's horrified by it and thinks that it's some kind of a sexual thing, that he's trying to assault her in some way. And she calls the police, and they come and take Deckard to this whole police station he's never heard of, and it's so surreal. And for that whole time I was thinking, oh my gosh, maybe Deckard's an android, maybe we had some kind of a time jump somewhere. I was so confused. And then the whole thing was just a fabrication made by these androids who were trying to stay alive, and you never knew what to believe. And Deckard never seemed rattled, but then he was questioning things afterwards. He was questioning his ability to empathize with androids. And then, he spent a lot of time trying to figure out if he really did see the androids as people, or if he was just capable of feeling lust towards the female ones. He was definitely attracted to Rachel Rosen. And it was interesting, after they slept together in the hotel room, he was saying that he was in love with her, and that he would leave his wife and marry her if it was legal. But then I never knew how sincere he was about that, because 2 minutes later, she admitted that she had done this to many people before. It was just kind of a strategy for dealing with bounty hunters. And then he wanted to kill her, and he couldn't actually do it, but he was thinking about it pretty hard. So that, sudden change of heart toward her, you know, I couldn't decide if that meant that he thought of her like a human or not, you know, especially because he didn't value his wife all that much. She kind of annoyed him. He said, oh, I wish I'd gotten rid of her years ago when we were thinking about splitting up. And then it never registered to him that he cheated on her. And that could be because he thought that Rachel Rosen wasn't a real person, so it didn't count. Or it could just be because he had very little compassion for his wife and didn't care at all about what she thought. So the main way that the characters in the book tried to distinguish humanity from artificial intelligence was through empathy and their just general ability to relate to other life forms, other human beings, things like that. And so right from the beginning, it was very interesting to see how much everyone cared about having an animal. You know, everyone had to have a pet, and it didn't really matter what kind it was, but it had been mandatory in the past, I think, and now it was just optional, but you had to have an animal. That was how you showed that you were human, basically. And I thought that was a very interesting sentiment because these people obviously valued their animals a lot and took a lot of care of them and spent most of their money on their animals. That was one of the most important things you could spend money on, was buying an animal. And the whole reason behind all this was because they thought that that showed their empathy. But throughout this whole experience where all these people are taking care of their animals, you don't necessarily see that it really does show that they have empathy, because Rick and his wife, their animal died and they have an artificial animal, which they don't love as much as their original sheep, but they still keep it to prove to the neighbors that they have animals. So that shows right away that it's more important that people think you have empathy and love something than that you really love something. And then when he buys his goat, he's very excited about it. He's glad it's a status symbol and stuff. And when it dies, he doesn't show any real emotion toward it. And it could just be that he was kind of expecting Rachel Rosen to kind of take revenge somehow, or it could be that he just thought of it as a status symbol and he didn't really value life any more than the androids do. And there's that heartbreaking scene when John Isidore has what he thinks is a mechanical cat that he's taking in to get serviced, and it's a real cat and it's really dying, and you can tell. And he believes that it's artificial, but he still doesn't like watching it suffer. So even when he thinks it's artificial, he still feels empathy for it. And that was like the hardest part of the book for me to get through, is just watching this poor sick cat die, and I just hated that part. Another really hard to get through scene was the scene toward the end when Isidore finds the spider and all the androids that he's taking care of, Pris and all her friends, say, oh, it doesn't need all of its legs, it can survive with just 4, and starts plucking them off to see what will happen. And so then you see how heartbroken Isidore is watching them mutilate this creature. And I don't even like spiders, and I felt bad for it. And at the same time, you know, as all the androids are gathered around torturing this spider, they're laughing at the TV saying, haha, we've just proven that androids and people are exactly the same. But while they're saying this, they're really demonstrating that they are very cold, hard beings who don't really know how to feel empathy for other creatures and don't know how to make their lives better. I also thought it was interesting, the androids, like, they demonstrate that they don't really feel love or attachment to each other. There is a couple who's kind of married. You don't really see if they care about each other that much or if it's just for convenience. And they definitely don't feel attachment to people, though that's understandable since humanity is trying to kill them. So it's interesting because they don't feel like strong attachment or love or anything like that, but then they definitely feel vengeance, and it's accepted that they do. So I think it's interesting that they could feel some human emotions, but not others. So Deckard is going on this whole journey trying to figure out if androids can have feelings, if there's any way for him to really distinguish himself from an android and kind of separate them and say what's better about humanity. But he ends up showing that he doesn't really have a whole lot of empathy. He doesn't care that much about his wife. He doesn't think he'll be able to kill the android that looks just like the woman he slept with, but then he's fine with it. It doesn't really seem to be that big of a deal. And the only character in this whole novel who ends up showing any kind of empathy or anything is John Isidore, who is the chicken head. The humans don't value him and the androids don't value him, and no one really thinks he's worthwhile, but he's the only character who has any kind of compassion. He cares about his neighbors and wants to get to know them. He wants to make friends. He actually likes animals and wants them to feel better. He cares about the androids. And so it's interesting that the only person who is completely devalued by every other character in the book is the one who actually has all these desirable traits that everyone seems to admire so much. So I really enjoyed this book. I thought it had a lot to say about human nature and just artificial intelligence, all kinds of things like that. It was really fun to read a book that was like very definitely sci-fi, not just like little bits of sci-fi sprinkled into another kind of story. So I enjoyed this a lot, and now I plan to go watch the movies and see how they compare to it.